Ďakujem. Mám veľmi stručnú otázku na pána profesora. Po úvode do problematiky peniazy a bankovníctva na základe princípov subjektívnej školy a kvantitatívnej teórie peniazy, akým spôsobom hodnotí súčasný stav a predpokladané zásadné zmeny, ktoré nastanú vo finančnom a peňažnom systéme? Ďakujem.
Well, I think a big part of the problem is.
There you go. Okay, now probably make more sense. I think the question being, what about the current system? As you can gather from my remarks, I think it's a very dangerous, volatile system that we have now. Fiat money and central banking established, so there's really no constraints. We've seen that the investment banks, they knew they were in an environment where if they made bad loans, they were going to get bailed out. And so I don't think we can ignore the institutional framework. I think part of the reason when we try to understand how did all these people at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and the big banks in Europe, how come they were so stupid? How did they do this? Well, part of it was that they were making a lot of money on the boom on the upswing, and they knew if it blew up in their face, they were going to get bailed out. I mean, they would hope it wouldn't blow up, but they knew that they had that backstop there, and so I think that's part of the explanation. And then again, in terms of the fiat money, yeah, I mean, the central banks right now, they think they can just create euros and create dollars with no constraint. So I think that's an illusion. That really there are constraints. We are going to see prices go up, but thus far we haven't seen that. So I think they're just going to make the situation worse, thinking that they're helping.
I want to be a finalist, I would like to ask about the limited quantities of gold today. What do you think about, is it possible to actually have a set of currencies backed by gold given the limited quantities in the world? And if not, what would you suggest as an alternative to this? Whether, like, as you said, the private banks loaning their own money, or a basket of commodities to supplement gold?
A great question. There's nothing magical about how much gold there is. So if the purchasing power would just have to reflect what the current quantity of gold is. So it's true you wouldn't be able to go back, like with the United States, for example. Historically, in 1971, it was $35 for 1 ounce of gold. Obviously, it would be crazy to try to go back to that price just because it would involve massive deflation. But whatever approach you wanted to do to link currencies back to gold, which is taking the new market price, and so I don't think there's no magic amount of how much gold you would need or not need. You just need to choose the right ratio.
But anyway, when we saw the chart, it cannot be denied that the gold was stabilizing price. So do you think that the gold is the recipe for the future? We can go back and stabilize the hyperinflation or inflation in general.
Yes, I mean, let me be clear. I actually, it's not my mission or my purpose to say I think that my plan for salvation is all the central banks tie their currency back to gold. I think that would ultimately fail too, just because the next time a crisis came, they would all abandon it, just like they did, right? So in World War I, if a nation that's sending bombers over to you drops the gold standard so they can print more money and buy more bombs, people aren't going to say, well, we're sticking to the gold standard, right? They're going to think that, oh, we need to do the same thing. So it's, if we ever got back into a situation where people believe that, oh, we need to abandon gold once again because of this worldwide catastrophe, I wouldn't trust them to do it. So what I'm just trying to explain is historically what the virtue of the classical gold standard was and why things are so bad now. I think ultimately the only way you're ever going to really have a chance at stability is if somehow we could get away from having central banking in the first place and just return money making back to the private sector. But when people don't like it because that seems so unrealistic, so when people say, okay, but tomorrow what should Ben Bernanke do? That's why to try to be helpful. I say, well, if he locked in the current price of gold and said that's it from now on, that's the dollar price of gold is going to be like that forever, I think that would be a much more sensible policy target than what it is that the Fed does right now, which to me sounds like they throw a dart at a board and then announce that. They don't actually, as far as I know, throw darts at boards. That was a joke.
My question regards to two fundamental things in your presentation. The first was the production of fiat money, and the second was fractional reserve banking. According to the Austrian school of thought, prohibiting these two things, so linking back national currencies to the gold, let's say like in the golden standard, and also maintaining 100% deposit ratios in the banking system would eliminate much of the banking crisis and these boom and bust cycles in the economy. My question is, it is possible to do it just in some part of the world, or it is a feasible solution that some countries return to the golden standard, some countries establish 100% reservation rates, some others do not. How it will work, I cannot imagine it. It is feasible, it is realistic. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, great question. So, yes, I think it is feasible that any one country that wanted to could go back to gold if that's what they wanted to do. What would happen, the reason it might in the short term seem problematic is that so let's say some country, Slovakia or maybe Iceland, let's say, if they tie their currency, just because they have their own currency so they could have that discretion, if they tied their currency to gold from now, they locked in their current price and their central bank started buying gold and stood prepared to redeem the krona for gold, what would happen, I think, is over time, their currency would appreciate against everybody else's. So the dollar would fall against the euro, would fall against their currency. So in the short term, they might not like that their exporters would be angry and say, oh, it's hard for us to sell our products. But I think, as long as they were disciplined and stuck to that policy, then they would be shielding themselves. They would be much less vulnerable to future world calamities. So it's certainly true. We're in a global environment in a little country. No matter what they do, if the rest of the world collapses, they're going to be hurt. But nonetheless, you're shielding your own people as much as you can if you have sensible monetary policies yourself. And especially if more and more countries started doing that, eventually I think you would avoid these worldwide catastrophes.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, what do you think about the project of North American Union and the new currency Amero? Should we consider it only as a conspiracy theory, or could it be a, possible real American future? Thank you.
Okay, so another good question. Got a lot of good questions. The question is this: there's been a proposal for what's called the Amero, and that would be a currency that would be a regional currency that Canada, the United States, and Mexico would all use. So of course, the term Amero being based on the term euro. So there are people that are very suspicious in the United States and elsewhere. They think that this is a plot of the international bankers. They're trying to take over the world. What I can say for sure is there really has been a proposal. I mean, there are academic economists in Canada, for example, who proposed this. I mean, there's papers you can Google the case for the Amero, and you can get the credentialed economist who came up with it. And this guy's point is to simply say, for all the reasons that the euro was supposed to be a good idea, we could do the same thing in North America and unify that. I personally think it would be a bad idea because, and that's also why, in case if someone wants to ask more about this, I can elaborate. I don't think the Euro project as currently conceived was good either, because what happens with these regional currencies in their modern form is the individual countries sort of give up their sovereignty to an organization that doesn't really answer to anybody, that it's sort of above them. So once your financial destiny is tied to this organization, the individual people in the various countries lose the ability to control what happens to them. So I would oppose the introduction of the Amero. I think that as bad as U.S. monetary policy is now, at least if Americans get angry enough, we might be able to make Ben Bernanke change his mind. But if it was some group that was not just answering to Americans, but to Canadians and Mexicans, there's that many more people that would be able to form a coalition to oppose bad policies.
I would like to ask you, Mr. Professor, that what do you think about basket currencies? SDR is proposed by the United Nations. Is this also real or just?
Okay, yeah, so the question is, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has floated proposals to say, look, clearly the US dollar can no longer be the world's reserve currency. We need to come up with a substitute. And the sorts of people that work at the IMF, their substitute's not going to be, let's go back on the classical gold standard. What they propose instead is that the IMF issues what's called SDRs, special drawing rights. And what that is, they want that to be the new, or the people making the proposal, want the SDR to be the new global currency. So the U.S., because of its falling in its significance and because of reckless Fed policy, now people realize it can't be the dollar anymore, so instead everybody will use these SDRs as the reserve currency. And what is it? It's a special claim issued by the IMF that's backed up by a basket of currencies. So that the dollar would be in there, but so would the Chinese yuan, so would the Japanese yen, so would the euro, and maybe they would have some commodities in there also to give the thing a solid foundation while the rest of the world adopted it. So I'm not sure if you were asking, is that a real thing in the sense, is it a real proposal? Yes, I mean, again, I've seen the actual IMF documents of academics, saying here's some blueprints, we might want to do this at some point. So there are definitely, whether it's the Amero or the SDR, these other proposals, these proposals are really out there. There are people putting them forward. As far as will it happen, I think Americans are they're very proud people. I'm sure I'm not surprising you by saying that. And they're very jealous of their perceived sovereignty and rights. So I think the only reason Americans would stop using dollars and either go for an Amero or for an SDR is if there was a huge catastrophe and the dollar crashed. Okay, but given the sorts of things that the Federal Reserve is doing, I think that's entirely possible that that's going to happen, within the next 10 years, let's say. All right, so I'm not sure it's going to happen, but it's possible given the sorts of things they're doing. In which case, yeah, I do think that the IMF might come in and say, okay, the dollar has failed. We need something to replace it. Let's use. Now we need a supranational currency. That's the only way to go forward, is to have a currency that's a combination of all the major players. I could definitely see that happening in the nightmare scenario where the dollar totally collapses.
I have a question. Let's imagine that one day you wake up as a Ben Bernanke. Well, would you let deflation happen? And I mean the real deflation, monetary deflation, not price deflation.
Okay, if I woke up as Ben Bernanke, the first thing I would do would shave the beard. Then, yes, what I would, yeah, if I were, and again, it's difficult. So let me be clear. In the Austrian, and I don't speak for all Austrians. I speak for, I think, most of the ones who work or associate with the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Our position, we're not saying everything's going to be fine. If people did the sorts of things we recommend, it would be really bad for probably 6 to 8 months. Because as you say, if the Fed stopped inflating and just let its assets mature and let its balance sheet shrink back down and suck those reserves out of the system, all of the big investment banks, the housing market, I mean, they would possibly all collapse again, because it would just be the opposite of the emergency interventions that the Fed did back in 2008. So I think that would happen. What is, in my perspective, is to say home prices are still too high. Okay, so the stock market, I think, is still overvalued. And so it's a mistake to try to say, oh, we need to make the economy go back to how it was in the good old days of 2006. That in my view, the economy, the U.S. economy in 2006 was in a bubble. It was an illusion. It had been pumped up. So it keeps wanting to come back down to reality, and the Fed keeps just creating dollars to keep pushing it up. So yes, to answer your question, I think the only thing that makes sense to get out of this endless stream of crisis, and we push it off for 3 months. Of crisis, we print more money and push it off, is to stop printing money. And it's sort of like a drug addict going cold turkey, to stop using drugs. The withdrawal is very painful, but that's ultimately the only thing that's going to fix it. Whereas right now, it's like the world markets now are addicted to more dollars from Ben Bernanke, and he's the drug dealer.
Áno, ďakujem. Spomínali sme teda teraz Ameriku a vlastne Amerika, USA teda, je konkrétnym prípadom tejto rozorvanej dialektiky peňazí. Historický štandard je obeživo peniaze, peňažné poukážky kryté zlatom. V 71. roku sa od tohto princípu upustilo a nastúpil zosilený trend globalizácie. A prešlo sa na princíp produkcie alebo ekonomickej sily alebo produkcie ekonomiky jednotlivých krajín, ktoré sú združené do istého menového systému. Projekt Euro bol typickým takýmto projektom, ktorý mal historicky odskúšať, ako to bude fungovať. To znamená fiat peniaze na báze produkčnej sily ekonomiky alebo integrovanej ekonomiky. Váš názor, prosím. Išlo o nový historický pokus, ktorý bol od začiatku mylný, alebo až prax ukázala, že ten systém je potrebné stále evolučne dopracovávať, lebo inak skolabuje a musíme sa teda, už by som povedal, v kritickej chvíli znova vrátiť historicky o 30-40 rokov dozadu a vrátiť sa na historicky osvedčenú bázu, to znamená peniaze kryté zlatom. Ďakujem.
Okay, let me say one general remark. The dream of the euro, the appeal of it, is this idea that, oh, we're going to integrate and we're going to have just like a common currency among this large economic region, and so that will lower transaction costs, right? It's very convenient if you're French and you go to Germany or you go to Austria or wherever, that you don't have to change the money over. That's very convenient, and so especially if you're a business and you have operations in multiple countries, you don't have to worry about exchange rate risk. You don't have to worry about the currencies moving against each other. So it makes things very easy. So for the very reason that money is useful, that everybody in one town or one city all uses money, if you can understand why that makes sense, well then, by extension or analogy, it makes sense that everybody in the same continent should use the same money. Right? So that's the underlying logic of it. But I want to point out, you don't need to have international organizations planning and administering this apparatus. There used to be a worldwide money, and it was gold. Okay? So the market left to itself would give us all the benefits of an integrated financial monetary system. You don't need to have wise technocrats planning that out. So to come back to your question, I think what was unique or novel about the Euro project was I believe, the first time you had this government-imposed and designed system of fiat money containing constituent nations that had their own sovereign governments. And so I think that's why this project never really had a chance of working, because of the natural instability in which we've seen in practice now. That if it's a fiat money, that means ultimately there's a danger that it's going to print too much, and so then the individual countries, the ones that are very conservative and don't want inflation, they're very nervous. And so that's why the Germans were reluctant to join, and so they wanted to have strict safeguards, and that's why they had, you know, the original treaty saying, okay, you have to have your deficit and your debts within very circumscribed limits, or else you can't join the euro, because they knew if countries were reckless and had big deficits, there would be this temptation with fiat euros just to print more of them. So just to show you the difference, suppose that from the beginning, the way the euro worked was that it was backed by gold, so that any nation in the world who wanted to use euros could go to this central organization and give a certain quantity of gold, and then they would give them euros in exchange. And at any given time, any paper euro in the world, you knew there was a fixed weight of gold sitting in a vault somewhere in Brussels backing it up. Well, then the people administering that system, they don't care what the government budget deficits are. Why do they care? Investors aren't going to worry about the euro if the Greek government issues too many bonds. Who cares? The people who hold euros know that the euros in Germany are perfectly safe because there's the gold backing it up. I think the reason now there's this concern is that people know, okay, if the Greek government or the Portuguese government or whoever, if they run too big deficits, the temptation is the people printing euros are going to print more, and that's going to lower the value of the euro. So that's why there's this tension. Again, you see the point there. The fundamental problem is that it's a fiat money. And so that's why you had to have all these safeguards about, well, you need to have this many, your deficit has to be this big and so forth. The whole reason for that is because of the danger of just printing unlimited amounts of euros. So to answer your question, yes, I think it was unique in that respect and what the euro project was trying to do, but ultimately there's no way that could work because you're ultimately relying on, here's the issue. You're saying we can't trust the member state governments to be responsible. So we're going to police them by having a government above them who will make sure that they're all honest. And I think, if you know you can't trust the local governments to be honest, why would you trust the people up here? And that's exactly, of course, what happened is, yeah, on paper you had all these strict requirements before you could join the euro. Your government, your fiscal behavior had to be according to these rules, and nobody enforced it. They didn't care. So it's, the classic political problem of who guards the guardians. I think it's the same thing here. And now they're going to say, oh, we're going to create something even above that. I mean, it just doesn't matter how high you keep going, that you're not going to get people in these institutions, I think, who don't have personal accountability. It's not going to work. I think it's always going to eventually blow up. I'm sorry my remarks are so pessimistic. So someday you guys have me come and talk about little puppies. It'll be much friendlier.
I would like to ask about Bitcoin. You have heard about the type of currency, the peer-to-peer cryptocurrency.
Oh, no. I don't know. Okay, just my general. Okay, so the question was about, it's called Bitcoin. I don't know how familiar you guys are with it. I'm not a very technical person in terms of computers. The idea is there's mathematical algorithms, and it's electronic currency, and it can only grow at a fixed rate. And so the idea is there's lots of people in the United States and I guess around the world. I think it was originally developed by a Japanese guy. The point is they're trying to get people, merchants are accepting it. So the idea is governments can't debase this, that it grows according to the internal algorithm, and it's very hard for it's hard to break the system. The way it works is all sorts of computers all verify the transactions, so it's based on the way cryptography works and public key encryption, if you're familiar with that stuff, which I've read about it, but I can't reproduce it for you here. So anyway, to answer the question, it's a very interesting concept. I think I've done a little bit of investigation into it. So far, it looks like it could work, and the only issue will be will enough people adopt it? Because right now, just a few people are using it. The only way it can actually become a useful money is if millions of people adopt it.
Hello?
Okay. I'd like to ask, I know there are two different opinions between the proponents of the free banking system. One thinks that it will evolve to a system where all the banks will need to have 100% reserves because everything can otherwise be unstable. But another economists think that even the fractional reserve banking will be stable and that it will inevitably evolve to this because it is more effective. I'd like to know what's your opinion about it.
Okay, good question. So what he's touched upon, I want to make sure I'm not misleading you. I think most Austrian economists today would endorse 99% of what I said in this lecture. There is this small disagreement, though, among current Austrians that some of them say the problem is not fractional reserve banking per se. If we just let, so I think just about all Austrians today think ideally you wouldn't have a central bank, that you would just have banks would be regular private businesses, just like restaurants and hair salons are private, you'd have banks and so forth. But the issue is, should it be illegal to issue more paper tickets than you have gold in the vault? Should that be a crime? Or as long as your customers all know exactly what you're doing and they know the risks and they know if there's a bank run, the issuer might have to say, sorry, we can't give you your money today, come back next week and maybe we'll have your gold for you then, we don't have it right now. As long as that's all contractually specified, so there's no fraud, some Austrians say that's perfectly legitimate, and in fact, that would be a more efficient system. That some Austrians today say it's okay if the currency is elastic, so that if the demand to hold money goes up, it's kind of wasteful that we have to go out and dig up more gold, that wastes real resources. It would be nicer if we could just print up more tickets, and then if the demand goes down, we destroy the tickets and so forth. Whereas there are other Austrians who, following the tradition of Murray Rothbard, who say, no, that's the whole problem, don't you understand? It's this creation of paper out of thin air that expands the money supply and causes the boom-bust cycle. So with this crowd right here, I mean, that's a very technical issue. My own feeling, if I had to guess, is that if the government weren't bailing out banks and relieving them of their contractual obligations, let me just make something clear. I probably didn't say this in the lecture. Historically, what happened, the reason you had these booms and then busts, even before central banking, but especially afterward, is that the government would take away the consequences to the banks of overextending credit. So in the United States, it was very famous when Franklin Roosevelt came in 1933. One of the first things he did is he declared what was called a bank holiday. So that's a very nice term. Oh, it was a holiday for the banks. How nice. They get to go to the beach. But what that really meant was there were people who wanted their money. They had given their gold to the banks and gotten pieces of paper that said, we're holding the gold for you. Come get your gold whenever you want. And the banks got caught making this, oh, sorry, we don't have your gold. And so instead of them getting in trouble, the government just came in and said, oh, bank holiday, don't worry, we'll close the banks and come back in a week or two and maybe, we can open the bank. So you can see if you had, just to give you an analogy, if you went to a dry cleaner, right, and you gave them your shirts to be laundered, and then they gave you tickets that said your shirt will be here tomorrow, and then you went back tomorrow and they said, oh, sorry, some guy down the street really wanted your shirt, so I rented it to him for $5. Come back next week and maybe I'll have your shirt back. You'd be stuck. And if you went to the government and said, hey, these guys, they violated the contract, and they said, oh, dry cleaner holiday, come back in 2 weeks, right? And then the history books would record that the great politician saved the shirt industry by declaring a dry cleaning holiday, right? So that's from from Murray Rothbard's perspective, that's what happened in banking, that you had these bankers who were greedy and lent out money and were very reckless, and then when it came back and they should have failed, the politicians came in and relieved them of their responsibilities. So, to go back to your question finally, I personally think as long as you just got rid of the government's support of fractional reserve banking, I don't really care what happens. I just let the market force decide. My prediction is it would be very close to 100% reserves, but I could be totally wrong. Maybe it would be 1% reserves. I don't know what it would be, but I think what you would see is they would be very stable. That once you had that reserve ratio that the market established, it wouldn't keep changing. Is my prediction. So, but I do also think it would be closer to 100%. But as you say, that is a controversy right now among modern Austrians. Some people say that no, if it's less than 100, you're going to get the boom-bust cycle, and others say no, as long as it's not supported by government, it's fine.
Hello? Actually, I have two questions. The first one, well, I really liked your graph where you showed the development of US dollars inflation since 1970s. So my first question would be, how do you see it? What do you think, based on your studies and research, how it will continue after 2010? And the second question is, imagine you had your savings in euro. What would you personally do in the following months or the year?
Right, okay. All right, so the first question is, as far as inflation in dollars, let me first be honest with you guys. I have been very worried about price inflation in dollar terms since the fall of 2008. So thus far, my critics in the United States, if they want to say that I'm wrong, they'll, I said some quotes about I expect CPI to be this level by 2010, and it wasn't that high. All right, so I have been overly pessimistic in the past about that. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer. I do still think that you are going to see huge price increases because I think, as we've seen lately, we're now in a position where whenever the world economy gets into trouble, people look at the Federal Reserve and say, Ben, you have to print more money. And that he's thus far been willing to do that. And so I think they're going to just keep doing that. That's the logic of the system they now have. You also, there are lots of indications that of pricing pressures already building up. So it's like the one thing that's not exploding right now are consumer prices with food and energy taken out. So that's the metric that they're using. But if you think about that, there's a big recession, unemployment's very high, so people are very tight with their money. And because food and energy are very expensive, because commodities went up, people don't have much money left to spend on anything else. So it's funny that the Federal Reserve officials are saying, no, there's no inflation problem because if you look at consumer prices and don't look at gas and don't look at food, everything's fine. Which, that's an odd way of saying that things are fine. But in any event, to answer your question, I do think you are going to see prices rising. They might not for a year or two because part of what's going on is the situation in Europe is so bad that investors are fleeing euro assets and going into dollar assets because the dollar treasuries are considered the safest thing. And so I think that's artificially making the dollar look very strong when it's not so much that the dollar is attractive, it's that everything else is unattractive. And so I think that's part of what's going on here. As far as your second question, you said, if I understood, basically people right now in the Eurozone, what do they do? My general advice for people, especially younger people, is just to say, save as much as you possibly can. And that means cutting down your expenditures and trying to boost your income. So if you have a regular job, that's great, but then on the weekend, try to do something entrepreneurial. Whatever it might be, walking dogs, babysitting, whatever, mowing your neighbor's lawn, whatever it is, buying things at garage sales and selling them on the internet. Any way you can start your own business to get multiple streams of income, I think that's a good idea, because if another crash comes, even if you have a good job right now, you might lose your job next year. And then I think it's a very safe thing if you don't already have some to acquire some physical gold and silver coins. That it's not like it's an investment, but just more as a defensive measure in case we do see massive euro inflation or dollar inflation, that at least if you have some coins, those things will go up in price so you can use them to get over that crisis while your income adjusts to the new level.
Hello. How does the Peniaze school view the recent findings by Rogoff and Reinhardt?
Can you repeat the name?
The Rogoff and Reinhardt findings about hyperinflation?
Are you? Let me just make sure I understand. Are you talking about how they're saying if government debt gets to a certain level?
That's it, yeah, the GDP ratio.
Right. Okay. So yeah, there is a are they from Harvard? Is that where they're from? Okay. I want to make sure I say something true because he actually can correct me. Yeah. So there's recently these economists from Harvard. They had done a historical study, and they were coming up with the sort of benchmark rules about when nations, when governments, when their debt exceeds a certain critical threshold. From there, things just go downhill. That it's hard for them to pull back from that abyss. So, to be honest with you, a lot of my colleagues, they're really not that familiar with that paper. To the extent they are, I think we generally like the conclusion that that's what we've been worrying about, big deficits as well, and just saying that to us it seems very obvious that, well, yeah, if governments keep spending more than they have eventually, and they can start printing money to cover the shortfall, bad things are going to happen. And once you go down that path, it's very seductive to say, oh, it's okay, we can run big deficits and monetize it with inflation, and we'll get through this crisis, and then we'll solve the political problems down the road. And that's what's happening in the United States. I'm sure that's what's happening in Europe too, where we know that Social Security and Medicare right now are unsustainable. That right now the beneficiaries of those programs are being promised too much compared to how much we're going to take in worker contributions. But instead of fixing it right now, people are saying, well, we're in the middle of a recession. We don't want to mess. Let's run deficits, print more money. Let's get through this crisis, and then when we're back to prosperity, we'll come back and fix these problems. But they never end up doing that. They just get out of the crisis, then it's the good times, the party, and then the crisis comes again, and they print more money. So I generally am sympathetic to their results, but I haven't studied them in depth.
Ono sa dá ťažko porovnať ekonomika s fyzikou. Vo fyzike je to jednoduchšie. Napríklad vo fyzike sa dospelo k takému poznaniu, že existuje rezonančné vlnenie, ktoré naruší akúkoľvek pevnostnú štruktúru. Dôkazom toho je Fukushima. Pretože tá elektrárne nebola zabezpečená na 15-metrové tsunami. Fyzika pripúšťa 30-60 metrové tsunami. Ako ekonómovia by sa mali všetci zamyslieť nad tým, že bol spustený atomový reaktor, ktorý nevieme vyregulovať. A tvrdím, ak sa to nestane, tak nie, že môžeme založiť 15-metrové tsunami, 30 metrové i 60 metrové. A preto treba rozvíjať všetky obranné mechanizmy, aby tu sa zabránilo proste týmto nekontrolovaným silám v ekonomike.
Máte otázku?
No, tak nie sa to súviselo.
Okay, I want to express my sympathy for the translator, so not only does he have to deal with financial terms, but he now had to interpret physical terms as well. Yeah, I mean, I agree with your sentiments. I just, from my perspective, I just want to point out that you also want to be careful, and just because some politicians or central bankers say, oh, we're going to put these new safeguards in place, that doesn't actually mean that we're necessarily safer, right? That there's a possibility that the very thing that they think is helping is actually going to make things worse. So again, if the Austrian analysis that I showed you is correct, it's not true to say that. I'm not sure if that's what you were saying, but in any event, it's not necessarily true that central banks coming in and regulating the private banks is at least making things less volatile, because again, we saw that might be crippling the private competitive mechanisms that would be limiting speculation.
Thank you. I'm not an economist, so I might have a stupid question, but I read in the newspaper that it's not worth buying gold right now because the prices of gold rise so high that it's actually a bubble. Could you comment on
Okay.
this?
Well, I am an economist, and this might be a stupid answer. So yeah, that's why earlier I had given the caveat. I'm not necessarily recommending, if I were advising a hedge fund manager, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, you want to get 40% exposure to gold and other commodities. I mean, that's a very specific thing, and I don't know, in terms of the time horizon, what gold's going to do. I think it's entirely possible, even a year from now, gold might be a lower dollar price than it is today. That's entirely possible. What I do think, though, is that people who right now don't have any gold or silver coins, if you started accumulating them so that you had, let's say, 3 to 4 months of your income right now in terms of those, I would be surprised if 10 years from now you would regret that. That you'd say, oh, I can't believe that idiot Murphy came and told me to do that. That's, so maybe you don't want to take a mortgage on your house and go buy gold coins. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it's a very, I think in my opinion, a good defensive mechanism just in case you do have this tsunami, if you will, of inflation, that's going to be, a little scuba air tank to mix metaphors.
Na záver by som chcel všetkým nám popriať, aby sme sa naozaj dožili zdravších a slobodnejších peňazí. A zároveň vás chcem pozvať na čašu vína, ktorá je oproti sále. Všetkým vám chcem poďakovať za účasť a pevne verím, že onedlho sa opäť raz stretneme. Chcem poďakovať našim partnerom za spoluprácu a osobitne chcem poďakovať nášmu vzácnemu hostovi za jeho prednášku a za diskusiu. Thank you very much.